In this lecture, I want to talk about the truth table for arrow, as well as for double arrow. So the kind of conditional that arrow is used to symbolize is referred to as logicians as a material conditional. I'll have more to say about that terminology in the next lecture. But for now, let's just see if we can figure out how we should fill out the truth table for a conditional of the form if A, then B. So I draw my grid. I list out all the possible combinations of true and false. Now I try to consult my linguistic competence in the same way I did for negation and for and for or. I try to consult my linguistic competence with conditionals to tell me how to fill in this truth table. And I think it's pretty clear how to fill in at least one of the rows of this truth table. So I think I can tell, just in virtue of my linguistic competence with conditionals, that a conditional of the form if A then B is false when the antecedent of that conditional is true but the consequent is false. That is, I think I can see that it is false under the conditions specified in the second row of this truth table. So for example, if I were to predict that if the next president is a Democrat, the next president will be a woman. If I were to assert that prediction, and it turned out that the next president is a Democrat but not a woman, then I will have been proven wrong. And the reason I will have been proven wrong is because that conditional I asserted, if the next president is a Democrat, then the next president will be a woman, has a true antecedent but a false consequent. So I think I can see that's the one condition under which, or at least that's one of the conditions under which a conditional of this form is false. Okay, but what about the other rows? How should I fill in the other rows? Well, it's not obvious to me how I should fill in the other rows. I don't know about you, but my linguistic competence with conditionals doesn't just tell me directly how I should fill in these rows. So, I'm kind of stuck. I need I need something else, some other kind of argument or something that tells me how to fill in these other rows. Let me give you an argument for how we should fill in these other rows. It's going to go like this. Alright, so let's start out by supposing that if A then B is true. Let's just suppose that for the sake of argument. Well, as we saw above, we know that if that's the case, then at the very least it's not the case that both A is true and B is false. We know that at the very least, if this conditional is true, then it can't be that it has a true antecedent but a false consequent. So it follows from our original supposition that it's not the case that A and not B. It follows that it's not the case that A and not B, that negated conjunction, is true. That negated conjunction just says it's not the case that the antecedent of our conditional A is true, but the consequent of our conditional B is false. So linguistic competence tells us that if A then B is true, then this negated conjunction is true. So we can see that if A then B is true, then it's not the case that A and not B. Okay, now let's go in the other direction. Let's suppose that that negated conjunction is true. Suppose that it's not the case that A and not B is true. Well, if that's the case, we can show that some other things follow. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that A is true. So we're supposing that this negated conjunction is true. We're supposing that it's not the case that both A and not B. And we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that A is true. Well, if A is true, then one of the conjuncts in the conjunction A and not B, namely A, is true. But we know that that whole conjunction is false because we've assumed that its negation is true. So since the whole conjunction is false, and for the whole conjunction to be false, it has to have at least one false conjunct, and the first of those conjuncts, by our assumption, is true. The other conjunct, namely not B, must be false. Alright, but if not B is false, then B is true. Okay, so if we put this all together, we see that given our original supposition, our supposition that it's not the case that A and not B is true, given that supposition and our assumption, namely our assumption that A is true, it must be the case that B is true. So if the negation of A and not B is true, then if A is true, then B is true. That is, it follows from our original supposition that if A is true, then B is true. Okay, so we can conclude that if not A and not B is true, then if A, then B is true. This argument is a little bit complicated. You may want to look it over a couple of times, but hopefully you can follow it. Okay, so given that argument, what we see is that if A then B is true, then it is not the case that A and not B is true, and vice versa. That is, if A then B is true when and only when it is not the case that A and not B is true. So if we can figure out the conditions under which it is not the case that A and not B is true, then we can also figure out the conditions under which if A then B is true. So this gives us a way to try to fill in our truth table for if A then B. So here is the truth table for it is not the case that A and not B. I won't bother to go through all the steps involved in filling out this truth table. In fact, I had you fill out something that looks just like this truth table when you did, except for you used propositional variables instead of variables for well-formed formula. I had you do that on your worksheet. It was the first problem on your worksheet. So I'm not going to go through all those steps again, but here is the truth table for it is not the case that A and not B. And the argument we just gave gives us a good reason to believe that the truth table for it is not the case that A and not B is the same as the truth table for if A then B. So note that there is only one condition under which this sentence is false, and that's when A is true and B is false. Likewise, there's only one condition under which the conditional if A then B is false, when A is true and B is false. Because if A then B is true when and only when it is not the case that A and not B is true, and the one case in which it is not the case that A and not B is false is when A is true and B is false. So that's the one case in which the conditional is false. In every other case, the conditional is true. So a conditional is true in every case except when its antecedent is true, but its consequent is false. So this is our truth table for arrow. Okay, now that we have our truth table for arrow, we can get a truth table for double arrow. So here is the definition of double arrow. Double arrow, or A double arrow B, is to be read A if and only if B. And by definition, that is the conjunction of if A then B and if B then A. So double arrow is really a defined symbol. We can define this symbol in terms of our previous symbols in terms of and arrow. And given this definition, we can fill in the truth table for double arrow. So we start out by identifying our main sentential connective here, that's and then we fill in the truth tables for each of the sentences that and joins together. So the first of those sentences is the sentence if A then B. Alright, well, we've already seen, so that sentence if A then B, to figure out when that's true, we'll just go ahead and figure out when A is true. Of course, we just copy down the column for A to the left over there. We do likewise with B. And then we fill in the truth table for if A then B, given what we've just discovered is the truth table for if A then B. So we know that when A is true and B is true, then it's true. We know the one case in which this conditional is false is when the antecedent is true but the consequent is false. So this is the one case in which it's false. In every other case, including the cases below, it's true. Okay, so now that we've filled in the sentence for if A then B, we can cross out these two columns. They're no longer relevant, and we can start working on the other sentence joined together by the main sentential connective, the other sentence joined together by the and. So we work on the sentence if B then A. So we go ahead and copy the column for B over here. True, false, true, false. We copy the column for A over here. True, true, false, false. Okay, so in the top row we see that B is true and A is true. So we know that the whole conditional is true. In the second row, we see that this conditional has a false antecedent but a true consequent, but that's also one of the conditions under which a conditional is true. In the third row, we see that the conditional has a true antecedent but a false consequent. That is the one and only condition in which a conditional is false. So we put false there. And in the final row, we see that it has a false antecedent and a false consequent. That is also a condition in which it is true. Okay, now that we've done that, we can cross out those two columns, and now we can go ahead and figure out when the whole big sentence is true. So it's an and, so it'll be true just in case both of the conjuncts are true. So in the top row, both of the conjuncts are true, so it is true. In the second row, one of the conjuncts, namely the one to the left, is false, so that's enough to make the whole conjunction false. In the third row, one of the conjuncts is false, namely the one to the right, so that's enough to make the whole conjunction false. In the final row, though, both of the conjuncts are true once again, so the conjunction is true. Okay, now we cross out those other two columns, and we have the main column that tells us when this whole big sentence is true. We see that it is true in two rows. It is true under the condition that A is true and B is true, and it is true under the condition that A is false and B is false. So A double arrow B is true when and only when A is true and B is true, or A is false and B is false. So A if and only if B is true just in case either both A and B are true or both A and B are false. This gives us the truth table for arrow. This gives us the truth table for double arrow, for if and only if. Okay, so now that we filled in the truth table for double arrow, we need to address some of the philosophical issues that arise when we think of conditionals in this way. But that's going to be the topic for the next lecture.